Well, this topic is probably one I should have done right before we left to go to Florida. It's a controversial topic, and I am not going to try to teach a lesson tonight that says, okay, this is definitely what the truth is. This is definitely what we will have to do, and have to look at this question this way. We'll have to look at it. But someone had requested a study on divorce and remarriage. And as usual, when a preacher prepares a special lesson targeting one person, that person doesn't show. That person's not here tonight. But at any rate, we're recording it so the person can get a chance to look at it later. But like I said, we're going to be trying to show what the passages of the Bible say. And what we're going to do is start off with a situation in the Old Testament that will hopefully cause us to back off a little bit on being quick to judge and quick to determine punishment, things like that. The story begins in 2 Samuel chapter 11. It's the springtime when kings go to war. And David does not go to war with his men. There's a time when David went to battle and he nearly got killed, and so they decided that he did not need to go with them anymore. It's not quite like taking Grandpa's car keys away from him, but it is something similar in taking care of David. And David is bored, and you know the story of what happens between him and Bathsheba. Now, in the Old Testament, I think you all know the Old Testament well enough to know what is the penalty for committing adultery. Death by stoning. Both people. That was a very important thing. The man and the woman were to be stoned, which is, the man is missing in the story in Jesus' day when he's teaching and they bring a woman caught in adultery, but not the man. But at any rate, the penalty for adultery is death. What is the penalty for committing murder? It is also death. David does both. Bathsheba does one of those two things. Neither one of them is held accountable to the punishment. Neither one is stoned to death. As a matter of fact, after this time when David has committed murder by proxy, having Uriah put in a position where it was a sure thing that the enemy would kill him, David not only gets off without being punished by death, but he also maintains his position as king. He also marries Bathsheba and keeps her as his wife. And also, there is something of an oddity here, I think it is, that in 1 Chronicles chapter 22, David talks about a son born to him and Bathsheba. Son's name is what? Solomon. In verse 9, David is recounting his efforts and his desire to build a house for God. But in verse 8, he said, "The word of the Lord came to me, saying, You have shed much blood and have waged great wars. You shall not build a house to my name, because you have shed so much blood on the earth before me. Behold, a son shall be born to you, who shall be a man of rest. And I will give him rest from all his enemies on every side, for his name shall be Solomon," a word that means peaceful. "And I will give peace and quiet to Israel in his days." Now, this is an expanded explanation of what God said to him through Nathan the prophet back in 2 Samuel chapter 7, when David initially comes up with the idea to build a house for God, and God he tells Nathan about the plans, and Nathan says, "Go with it." And Nathan leaves his presence, and after Nathan leaves his presence, God said, do I get a vote in this? No, you go back to David and tell him, no, he's not going to, but I will let his son, someone to come later to build that house for me. That's in 2 Samuel chapter 7. 1 Chronicles 22 gives us the added information of exactly why God does not want David to build his house, because David's a man of bloodshed. He got where he was by waging wars. It was necessary, but inappropriate for a man who had to do the dirty work like that and be associated with bloodshed to be in charge of building a temple to God. And something else about this that kind of struck me finally after studying this for a while. 1 Chronicles tells us that God told him, I'm going to give you a son, and his name is going to be called Solomon. That's what happened in 2 Samuel 7. A moment ago, the story of David and Bathsheba takes place in what chapter? Chapter 11. 2 Samuel is pretty much done in chronological order. God named Solomon as the one to build his house before David and Bathsheba even got involved. God knew this was coming, didn't he? And God still had a plan that involved a child born to these two adulterers, the son of an adulterer and a murderer, who did not pay a physical price for their sins that was demanded in the Old Testament. Yes?
Kind of reminds you or gets you to thinking that God knew what was going to happen with the other sons of David, and how after Nathan tells him the parable and says, you're the one that's done this, the sword will never leave your family. It really wasn't until Solomon came along and divided. They really just killed themselves and split the family apart. Really.
Mm-hmm.
It took Solomon to step up and be that one person there.
Yes.
To do that.
And, it's one of those situations where, God knows our weaknesses, and he shows how he can make things work out even when we mess up. And he can take our mistakes and still work his will throughout all of it. Does not mean he wants us to make those mistakes. It just means that God can work with us in spite of our mistakes. And the reason I bring that up is because when we talk about matters of marriage and divorce and so on like that, is a very sensitive topic. It's a very serious topic. It's one that's touched the lives of so many people, either directly or indirectly. And because of that, we want to tread lightly on this, but we also want to know what is God's will concerning this. And we want to abide by that will even when it is difficult for us to do so. So, like I said, the reason I brought that up is here's the situation that seems clear-cut. Here's what ought to be done. If you are a legalist, if you're the DA, you say, we got to pursue the death penalty, and God intervenes and says, you will not die. I've forgiven you. And so he sets aside the obvious sentences that should have or perhaps could have been enforced. Now, another situation, and this is just to get everybody thinking. I know you've had a long day at work, and or if you're retired, you had a long day of chores. But at any rate, here's another one. I'm going to present, given our understanding, our current understanding of divorce and remarriage, what would you say is the solution for this problem? Sam and Sue meet and fall in love with one another. Another couple, Jack and Jane, fall in love and they marry one another. Everything goes along fine for a few years. Then there are problems, and Sam and Sue get divorced, and Jack and Jane get divorced. And later on, Sam ends up marrying Jane, and Jack ends up marrying Sue. So you've got Sam and Jane and Jack and Sue now, instead of the other way around. Then both couples move into the same general area, and they have neighbors that are Christians. And the neighbor said, "Do y'all go to church anywhere?" "No, we never have." "You're not a member of any church or anything?" "No, we are not a member of any church." "Would you like to do a Bible study?" "Yes, we would." So they do a Bible study, and all four of them are invited by members of the same congregation. We're going to complicate things here just a bit, okay? So they all four come to the same church building. Sue and Jack come first, and they go forward and they want to be baptized, and they are baptized. And a couple of weeks later, Sam and Jane show up, and they say, "We want to be baptized," and they are baptized. Now they're all members of the same congregation, and people say, "How did you guys meet?" And the story is told. This congregation now has two couples who divorced because of incompatibility. One time I was talking with the fellow I worked with during the summers while I was in college, and he talked with me about his first wife. He said, we got divorced because of incompatibility. I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah, I couldn't get along with her boyfriend." So, but at any rate, let's just say that that's the cause for these divorces. Now the church elders and the preacher find out about it. What are they going to do? What's the solution to this situation? And I'm not going to complicate it by throwing in children, okay? I'll make it a little bit easier on you. What do you do? Yes, Manuel?
I've kind of heard similar things to this before, right? And my gut feeling, looking at the scriptures, based on the scriptures, is that they were non-Christians, they're baptized, the blood of Christ washes away all sins. It's blotted out sins, as if it never happened.
Okay.
So, to me, that's not, it doesn't respect one sin over another sin. The sin of divorce, before they're Christians, everything they do is sinful because they're covered in sin. So now that they're washed clean, sin is gone, everybody should be happy.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
Jesus told the lady at the well, "We don't sin no more." She had 5 husbands, and what she was with at that time was not her husband.
Okay. The woman brought to be stoned, "Go and sin no more." The other woman said, "Go call your husband." "I ain't got one." Boy, and Jesus said, "Boy, howdy, did you peg that one right?" That's not the original Greek, but anyway.
I kind of agree with what Jesus tells the men ready to stone the woman caught in adultery. He who's without sin, cast the first stone. I mean, we all sin.
Okay.
And this is something that touches everybody. The solution would be to try to teach the kids, the children, listen, marriage is supposed to be between man and woman till death do you part. You try to do everything you can to maintain that.
Mhm.
Not that it's always going to be that way, but you should really think about who you're going to marry and have a resolve and stand there if you do decide to marry that person.
Okay. Now, Manuel, this is for the benefit of those who are watching this and can't hear what you all are saying. Manuel's thought is, once they're baptized, all their sins, their past sins have all been forgiven. Is that a fair summation? Alan's comment was, woman is caught in adultery, she's told to go and sin no more. She's not stoned to death either, is she? And so, in Tim's talking about being careful, about, teaching who you marry and being cautious on that. May I play devil's advocate for a moment? Already have. What if a thief becomes a Christian? Does he get to keep what he's stolen before he was baptized? No. He's stolen a bunch of stuff. Okay, we got to go with my hypothetical here. He's got $10,000 in cash that he's stolen from various people. Then he hears the gospel. He realizes he's sinned. It's wrong. So he's baptized. What does he do now? Does he keep it because all of his past sins have been washed away? If somebody could prove he defrauded him, yes. Yes, Jeff.
But wouldn't you say that the couple were now bound in the covenant? So, and before they became Christians, but when they became Christians, they came Christians together, I guess, but they are bound by a covenant.
Okay.
And it kind of reminds me of what Paul writes in 1 Corinthians.
Are you talking about chapter 7?
Yep.
Hold off on that, okay? We'll be there in a moment. It's like this one preacher says, brethren, we're going to be studying tonight. So if you got a favorite passage, just find it and open up there, and we'll get there in a moment, eventually. But the idea there is, what I did was I tossed in an apple and asked you to compare it to oranges. It's not the same thing. And it's not fair to do that kind of thing to you guys, but I'm not a fair person. So, I had one person in class at one church tell somebody, I asked a question, I thought the answer was obvious. It wasn't obvious enough. He gave the exact wrong answer, and I tried to answer it, correct it as gently as I could. And he went out of the classroom and told somebody, David can send you out on the end of a branch and saw it off behind you before you've known what's happened. And I don't intend to do that, but sometimes it happens. I've been told by some, their opinion was, with Sam and Sue and Jack and Jane, what they need to do after becoming Christians is dissolve those marriages and go back to the original situation of their marriages. Sam and Sue together, Jack and Jane together. And I said, do you think that's what Jesus had in mind? And they said, yes. When Jesus talked about divorce and remarriage in Matthew 5 and in Matthew 19, we'll be there in a moment, I think that's what he had in mind. And I said, it can't be. And they asked, why not? I said, well, let's go to Deuteronomy Chapter 24. Jesus had told his listeners that anyone who taught anyone else to not abide by the law of Moses would be counted least in the kingdom of God. In other words, he is not approving of anyone teaching anyone during his lifetime while the law was still in effect that you can disregard the law of Moses. Now, in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4, says, when a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, that kind of became a point of debate with the Jews. What's an indecency? What did God mean by indecency? Well, she burned the toast. So, I don't like that. So I'm going to get rid of her. Well, it could be something as trivial as that in the minds of some. Something more serious, I think, is what God had in mind. But continues on, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out from his house. And she leaves his house and goes and becomes another man's wife. And if the latter husband turns against her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of her house, or if the latter husband dies, who took her to be his wife, then the former husband who sent her away is not allowed to take her again to be his wife, since she has been defiled, for that is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin on the land which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance. That shoots the idea of dissolving the marriages and going back together out of the water, doesn't it? Because Jesus could not have meant that. If he meant that, and the Pharisees knew that he meant that, they would have had cause to justly condemn Jesus for not abiding by the law of Moses. So that's not what Jesus had in mind, the idea of doing that. And after I presented that passage, the people I was talking to came up with another solution. Well, they just have to separate and remain celibate the rest of their lives. I said, you were so sure of your answer a while ago, and now you've come up with another sure answer. I don't think it works that way. I don't think it's that easy to do that. So what I want to do in the time we have remaining, and I'm hoping we can get through this, Matthew 5 and Matthew 19 basically say the same thing. And the circumstances under which Jesus does answer these questions is a little bit different. But if you go to Matthew 19, some Pharisees came to him testing him and said, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause at all?" He answered, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this cause a man shall leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Consequently, they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate." They said to him, "Why then did Moses command to give her certificate and divorce her?" He said to them, "Because of the hardness of your heart. Moses permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it has not been this way." Now, briefly interrupt the reading here to explain something. In the rest of the world during the days of Moses, men were just kicking their wives out when they got unhappy with them, not legally divorcing them, which made it tremendously difficult for the wife because she's not divorced. She is technically still another man's wife, but she cannot marry somebody else without that divorce decree. She doesn't go back home without that divorce decree. So it basically throws her out on the street. And what God does in requiring a divorce decree is to be fair to the woman. And it's a fairness that was not common in those days. So God says, no, we're not going to treat the women this way. Reading on verse 9. "And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for immorality and marries another woman commits adultery." Immorality is the Greek word porneia. Guess what word we get from that? Pornography. Yes. Adultery is sometimes used to translate this word in the New Testament and other places, but it's a word that means sexual immorality. There are all kinds of different sexual, deviant, sometimes immoralities. And Jesus said, except if it's this cause, then a man is not to divorce his wife. And if she marries another, she becomes an adulteress. If he marries someone else, he's an adulterer too, when you combine that with Matthew 5. So it sounds pretty cut and dried, doesn't it? The only reason that you should be able to divorce or remarry is if one of the parties is unfaithful in some sort of porneia way. And that sounds pretty clear, doesn't it? But to whom is Jesus talking? His disciples, and who asked the question? The Jews. And there's probably a crowd around listening too. This is kind of like juicy gossip in a way. This is of interest to a lot of people. If you hear people talking about this, especially Jesus talking about this, you're going to say, "Oh, wait, I want to hear what he has to say about this." So there are going to be people listening. So he's talking to Jewish people, is he not? He's talking to people who are in that covenant relationship with God. They're also in their covenant relationship of marriage. Now we're going to go to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Because, I'll just say this in passing, in John chapter 16, verses 12 and 13, Jesus told his disciples, I have many other things to tell you, but you cannot bear them now. But when the Comforter, the Holy Spirit, comes, he will instruct you and guide you into all truth, into all these things. So Jesus said, there are some topics I would love to talk to you about, but you can't handle them now. And this is not a parent telling a child, you'll understand this later. It's part of that, but I think also part of it is they have not envisioned the worldwide nature of what Jesus came to do. And because they have not envisioned that, they have not even imagined what all may happen as a result, what problems and situations they're going to run into. In 1 Corinthians 7, the Apostle Paul is going to deal with problems of marriage and separation and possible remarriage by implication here in chapter 7. Let's start in verse 10. We'll read verse 10 and 11 because he addresses one group there, then he addresses another group right after that. Verse 10, but to the married I give instructions, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not leave her husband. But if she does leave, let her remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and that the husband should not send his wife away. And this is also leave. The same Greek word is used in both cases. Don't leave the other person. Some translations will put in the word divorce here. Okay? I don't think the Jewish people had a word for divorce. It was just leave. And that's basically what happens with a divorce anyway. But notice what Paul says. Who's giving the instruction here in verses 10 and 11? The Lord. Paul says, the Lord, not I. Who's he talking to? To the married. Okay. You people out there that are married, here's some instructions. Don't leave each other. Don't leave each other. If you do, what do? You remain separate until you reconcile. If you're going to reconcile, you remain separate. And this is kind of like saying you remain single. Remain unmarried. So this is instructions given to members of the church who are perhaps contemplating divorce. And he says, this is something that the Lord said. And that coincides, that particular command will coincide hand in glove and fit perfectly with what Jesus said in Matthew 5 and in Matthew 19 about the marriage divorce situation. But Paul addresses another group in verse 12. And he'll talk about this in verses 12 and, well, we'll just read on. But to the rest, I say. To the rest who? Let's listen. If any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, let him not send her away. And a woman who has an unbelieving husband and he consents to live with her, let her not send her husband away. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified through her believing husband, for otherwise your children are unclean, but now they are holy. Yet if the unbelieving one leaves, let him leave. The brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. And then he offers explanation in verse 16. If you think you've got to stay together because you might save them at some point, he says, you don't know that. You don't know that. Don't try to force them to stay. Don't go compromising your faith in order to keep the marriage together. Let them go. This is to people in the church who are there, and the wife is there, the husband's at home because he's not a believer. Or the husband is in the worship assembly and the wife isn't because she's not a believer. And notice what he said there in verse 12. To the rest, I say, not the Lord. Now, Paul doesn't say that to say, this is my opinion. This is what I think. Because there are times when he will say that. As a matter of fact, he already did say that in verse 6. Talking about, hey, I think it's better you guys don't even marry. And then he says in verse 6, I say this by way of concession, not command. This is just my thinking, he says, not a command. But in verse 12, I'm saying this. And he's saying this as an inspired writer of the New Testament. Jesus did not cover this. Jesus didn't cover a Jewish person married to an unbelieving Gentile. He covered people who are already both in a covenant relationship with God. In the church, we have people who are both in a covenant relationship with God as well as a covenant relationship with each other. That's verses 10 and 11. But then you always have those that are in verse 12 that are married to someone who's not a member of the church. My mother married my father when my father was not a member of the church. He became a Christian when I was in the 2nd grade. Sunday night around midnight. Sermon just finally ate away at him till he said, I got to go be baptized tonight. But he wasn't a Christian at first. But Paul's talking about a situation here where somebody may have a divorce because after this one person becomes a Christian, the other person says, hey, I didn't sign on for this when we got married. I'm leaving. And so now you've got a single person. What's their status? Do they have to remain unmarried? He doesn't give that instruction like he did there in verses 10 and 11. He tells them they are not under bondage in such cases. There's a lot of people who don't want to concede the fact that these people can remarry. So they say, well, bondage means that they're not required to hold the marriage together. You know, you can't hold a marriage together by yourself. In Oklahoma, if one person in the marriage says, this is not working, I want a divorce, they can get a divorce. Doesn't matter if the other person says, hey, I think we can work this out. And the judge says, no. You got one person that says you can't, and you've got to have two that says you can. In Romans 7, Paul talks about the law, but he uses marriage as an example of why the Jews can leave the law justly, because they've died to the law. And he does it this way. He says in verse 2, the married woman is bound by the law to her husband while he's living. But if her husband dies, she's released from the law concerning her husband. So then, if while her husband is living, she's joined to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. But if her husband dies, she is free from the law, so that she is not an adulteress, even though she is joined to another man. The word bondage there, she is bound, is a Greek word that basically it also means slavery. It's a Greek. I wrote it down because I knew I would forget it if I didn't. It's the word dedulatai. It's a verb form of the noun doulos, which means slave. He says, if a woman's husband dies, she's not in bondage now to that marriage. She's free from it. In 1 Corinthians 7, when Paul said, which verse is that? Verse 15, the brother or sister, if the unbeliever departs, the brother or sister is not under bondage. He uses the very same Greek word that he used in Romans 7. He's wanting us to understand what he means by bondage. That means free to marry. This is a marriage dissolved by something other, probably, than immorality. And it leaves the Christian believer free to remarry. Paul said, that's my teaching. Jesus didn't say that. But Jesus tells us in John 16, 12, and 13, I can't tell you everything. You're going to have to let the Holy Spirit guide you into some of this truth. And so that situation means that the divorce remarriage issue is not a simple, a simple thing that we can apply one set of rules for everybody. There's a little different set of rules for somebody who's married to a non-Christian. But also, I want us to kind of also think about the mercy God showed to David and to Bathsheba in spite of their guilt. And he did not only dissolve that marriage, but he blessed that marriage by saying, you're going to have another child, and he's going to be king. That's something I think we cannot ignore the significance of that, what God did with that situation. Anyway, I said I wasn't going to come down hard on one way or the other, but that's my opinion, okay? That's my opinion, because this is a topic you can't solve in one 45-minute class, especially when you start 5 or 10 minutes late, like I always do. Anyway, any further questions or comments before we dismiss class? May you speak now or forever hold your peace. Okay.